One of the world's most critical energy choke points is under threat, and when the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which nearly a fifth of the world's traded oil flows every single day, faces disruption, the entire global energy market feels it instantly. Oil prices spike. Energy security alarms activate in capitals from Tokyo to Berlin to Washington, and importing nations that depend on Middle Eastern crude begin making calls, urgent, serious calls, to any reliable supplier that can deliver stable, rule-of-law-backed energy outside that troubled corridor. Canada gets those calls, because Canada is exactly what the world is looking for right now. A politically stable, treaty-governed, democratically accountable, major oil producer with West Coast export infrastructure now operating at meaningful capacity, pointing directly toward the Pacific, directly toward the markets most desperate for an alternative to Middle Eastern supply. But here's the part of this story that every Canadian needs to understand clearly. This is not just a geopolitical story about a distant waterway. It is a story about what global energy disruption means for Canadian oil prices, Canadian energy revenues, Canadian household costs, and the decisions being made right now in Ottawa and at the Bank of Canada in response to a global energy market that has suddenly become significantly more volatile. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is happening, what it means for Canada's energy sector and economy, how it affects Canadian households from Alberta to Nova Scotia, and what you can do right now to stay accurately informed. Welcome to Maple Wire. Glad you are here. Today we are breaking down the global energy market disruption connected to Strait of Hormuz tensions, what it means for Canadian oil production and export capacity, how the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion positions Canada in a disrupted global energy market, what the federal government and the Bank of Canada are monitoring, and what the real implications are for Canadian workers, taxpayers, households, and the provinces most directly connected to Canada's energy economy. We will cover who benefits, who faces new pressures, what mistakes Canadians are making, and exactly where to find verified official information. This video is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial, legal, or policy advice. Always verify directly with official Canadian government sources. All links are in the description below. Subscribe to Maple Wire if you are not already. When global energy markets move this fast, the downstream consequences for Canadian households arrive quickly. We track them so you have the context you need. To understand why Hormuz disruption matters so much to Canada specifically, and not just to global energy markets in the abstract, you need to understand how the global oil market works and where Canada sits within it. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded petroleum flows daily. Crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself bound for refineries in Asia, Europe, and beyond. According to publicly available international energy data referenced by Natural Resources Canada in its global energy assessments, the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important oil transit choke point in the world. Disruption to that passage, whether through military conflict, naval blockade, or Iranian closure threats, creates immediate and significant upward pressure on global oil prices. When global oil prices spike, Canadian energy economics change. And they change in ways that have direct consequences for Alberta's provincial budget, for Canadian energy sector employment, for federal corporate tax revenues, and for the broader national economic picture. Canada is a net oil exporter. Unlike countries that must import oil at world prices, Canada produces more oil than it consumes domestically, and the value of that production is directly tied to global benchmark prices. When Hormuz disruption pushes world oil prices upward, Canadian crude producers receive higher prices for their output. According to Natural Resources Canada and the Canada Energy Regulator, the Western Canadian Select Price, the benchmark for Alberta heavy crude, moves in relationship to global oil price dynamics, including the premium that global supply disruption places on reliable, non-Middle Eastern supply. When Middle Eastern supply is threatened, Canadian crude becomes more valuable not just because of the price move, but because of what it represents. Stable, rule-of-law production from a treaty-governed democratic nation outside the geopolitical instability corridor. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which tripled Canada's West Coast export capacity and created a direct pipeline connection from Alberta to Pacific Tidewater, is the infrastructure that makes Canada's positioning in this moment operational rather than theoretical. According to Trans Mountain Corporation's publicly available operational information and Government of Canada communications, the expanded system's capacity enables meaningful volumes of Canadian crude to reach Burnaby's Westridge Marine Terminal, and from there, via tanker, to Asia-Pacific markets. When Hormuz disruption threatens Middle Eastern supply to those same Asia-Pacific markets, Japan, South Korea, India, and others that depend heavily on Gulf crude, Canadian crude arriving at Pacific ports represents exactly the alternative supply those markets need. The geography is favorable. The infrastructure is now in place. And the political and commercial reliability of Canadian supply is a selling point that no Middle Eastern producer can currently match. According to Natural Resources Canada's energy market assessments and publicly available federal government communications, Canada has been actively developing commercial relationships with Asia-Pacific energy buyers, relationships that position Canadian crude as a genuine, scalable alternative to Middle Eastern supply for Pacific market customers. These relationships, built over time through the Trade Commissioner Service and through direct commercial engagement by Canadian energy producers, become immediately more valuable when Middle Eastern supply reliability is in question. For Alberta, the economic implications of elevated global oil prices, driven by Hormuz disruption and supply insecurity, are significant and direct. Alberta's provincial budget depends heavily on oil royalty revenues, which scale with production volumes and commodity prices. According to Statistics Canada and Alberta government fiscal reporting, oil price movements have material impacts on Alberta's royalty revenues and therefore on the province's ability to fund public services, infrastructure, and economic diversification programs. A period of sustained elevated oil prices, driven by genuine global supply disruption, improves Alberta's fiscal position in ways that have downstream effects on provincial spending, employment, and economic activity. For Canadian energy sector workers, in oil sands operations, in pipeline maintenance, in marine terminal operations, and in the supply chain businesses that support all of these, elevated commodity prices driven by global supply disruption support stronger sector economics. When producers are receiving better prices for their output, the case for maintaining or expanding production improves, and with it, the employment and wage conditions for workers in the sector. For British Columbia, the Westridge Marine Terminal and the Trans Mountain Corridor through the province are the operational infrastructure through which Canada's response to global energy demand plays out. BC's port operations, logistics sector, and marine industry all have direct commercial stakes in elevated utilization of West Coast oil export capacity. At the same time, BC's environmental stewardship responsibilities, including management of increased tanker traffic in coastal waters, are ongoing and consequential. For Canadian taxpayers nationally, the federal government's ownership of Trans Mountain Corporation means that elevated utilization and improved commercial performance of the pipeline system in a high-price environment has direct implications for public balance sheets. The federal government has stated its intention to transition Trans Mountain ownership, and a period of strong commodity prices and high throughput improves the commercial case for that transition and potentially the value recoverable by taxpayers from any disposition. For Canadian households, the connection between global oil price spikes and everyday costs is real and runs in multiple directions simultaneously. On one hand, elevated global oil prices that benefit Canadian producers and improve Alberta and federal revenues provide fiscal capacity that supports public services and economic stability. On the other hand, elevated global oil prices feed through into domestic fuel prices, gasoline, diesel, heating fuel, that Canadian households pay directly. The net household impact of an oil price spike depends on the specific province, the household's fuel consumption patterns, and the degree to which elevated energy sector revenues translate into fiscal support that offsets consumer cost increases. According to statistics, Canada's Consumer Price Index monitoring, energy costs are a component of the inflation measure that affects Canadian household purchasing power. The Bank of Canada, which targets inflation and manages interest rates to maintain price stability, monitors energy price movements as a significant input into its inflation assessment. An extended period of elevated global oil prices, driven by genuine supply disruption, would be a factor in the Bank of Canada's assessment of inflation, and therefore in its monetary policy decisions. For Canadians with variable rate mortgages or interest-sensitive debt, the connection between global energy market disruption and domestic interest rate decisions is real and worth understanding. For small businesses in Canada, particularly those with high energy input costs, those in transportation and logistics, or those serving the energy sector directly, elevated global oil prices create a cost environment that requires active management. Fuel surcharges, energy input cost increases, and supply chain cost pressures all become more significant when global oil prices are elevated. Federal and provincial business support programs, accessible through the Business Development Bank of Canada, and provincial economic development agencies are the most relevant resources for businesses navigating elevated energy costs. For renters and lower-income households who face higher gasoline and heating costs without the offsetting benefit of energy sector employment or investment returns, an oil price spike driven by global disruption is primarily a cost burden. Federal and provincial energy affordability programs, accessible through provincial government websites and the Government of Canada's benefits portal at canada.ca, are the most directly relevant supports for households facing elevated energy costs. For students and young Canadians, the energy market volatility connected to global geopolitical disruption underscores the strategic importance of Canada's energy sector, both as a current economic foundation and as a long-term career and investment landscape. The combination of Canadian energy resources, new export infrastructure, and global demand for stable supply creates a sector with genuine long-term economic relevance. Now let us address the mistakes Canadians are making when they process headlines about Hormuz disruption and Canadian energy positioning. Because on a topic this geopolitically charged, the gap between headlines and reality is often significant. The first mistake is assuming that Hormuz disruption automatically produces sustained and immediate benefit for all Canadians equally. The benefits of elevated oil prices flow most directly to Alberta producers. Alberta's provincial budget, federal corporate tax revenues from energy companies, and workers in the energy sector. The costs of elevated oil prices, higher fuel costs for households and businesses, are distributed much more broadly. The net impact on any specific Canadian household depends enormously on that household's economic relationship to the energy sector. The second mistake is treating Canadian West Coast export capacity as unlimited and immediately scalable to absorb any level of global demand. Trans Mountain expanded capacity significantly, but it operates within physical and commercial constraints. Actual throughput depends on commercial contracts, producer shipping commitments, tanker availability, and Asian buyer capacity to absorb additional Canadian supply. The opportunity created by Hormuz disruption is real, but realizing it at scale takes time and commercial coordination that cannot happen overnight. The third mistake is ignoring the Bank of Canada's independent role in managing the domestic economic consequences of global energy price movements. The bank does not control global oil prices, but it does manage domestic monetary policy in response to the inflation and economic conditions those prices create. Canadians who understand the connection between global energy market disruption and Bank of Canada interest rate decisions are better positioned to make informed financial decisions about rate-sensitive debt. The fourth mistake is failing to verify energy market claims against official Canadian government sources. Global energy market developments generate enormous volumes of commentary, speculation, and analysis of widely varying quality. Natural Resources Canada, the Canada Energy Regulator, the Bank of Canada, and Statistics Canada are the authoritative Canadian sources for energy sector data, economic assessments, and policy positions. Secondary sources, however prominent, should be verified against these primary references. Here is your verified action checklist for staying accurately informed as this global energy story develops. Visit Natural Resources Canada through canada.ca for authoritative information on Canada's energy sector, production data, export capacity, and the strategic implications of global energy market developments for Canadian producers and the national economy. Check the Canada Energy Regulator at cerrec.dc.ca for pipeline throughput data, West Coast export volumes, and regulatory information about Trans Mountain operations. This is the most authoritative public source for operational data on Canadian energy infrastructure. Monitor the Bank of Canada at bankofcanada.ca for economic assessments addressing energy price impacts on Canadian inflation and the implications for monetary policy decisions. Rate decision dates are published in advance. Knowing when they are coming is practical preparation for Canadians with variable rate financial obligations. Follow Global Affairs Canada at International GTZCA for updates on Canada's diplomatic and trade responses to global energy market disruption, including any government communications about Canadian energy positioning in the current international environment. If you are a household facing elevated fuel or heating costs, visit Canada.ca's benefits portal for information on federal energy affordability programs, and check your provincial government's website for province-specific energy cost support measures. If you are a small business with elevated energy input costs, contact the Business Development Bank of Canada at bdc.ia for advisory support and review provincial business energy programs through your Provincial Economic Development Ministry. Drop a comment below with your province. If you work in the energy sector, if your household is feeling elevated fuel costs, if your small business is navigating higher energy expenses, tell us how global energy market disruption is landing in your community. Is Canada positioned to benefit? Is your household feeling the cost pressure? We read every comment, and your perspective is part of this story. Here is your rapid recap. Strait of Hormuz disruption, whether from Iranian threats, regional conflict, or naval tension, creates immediate global oil price pressure by threatening approximately 20% of world-traded petroleum supply. Canada, as a major oil producer with new West Coast export infrastructure through the Trans Mountain expansion, is positioned as a reliable alternative supply source for Asia-Pacific markets disrupted by Middle Eastern supply insecurity. Elevated global oil prices improve Alberta producer revenues, provincial royalty income, and federal corporate tax revenues from the energy sector. The same price elevation increases household fuel and heating costs, creating a distributional impact that varies significantly by province and by household economic relationship to the energy sector. The Bank of Canada monitors energy price movements as a factor in its inflation assessment and monetary policy decisions. And Canadians should track Natural Resources Canada, the Canada Energy Regulator, and the Bank of Canada as their primary authoritative sources for understanding what global energy disruption means for Canada specifically. The open question this story leaves us with is how long and how deep the current Hormuz disruption will be, and whether Canada's West Coast export infrastructure and commercial relationships can be mobilized quickly enough to meaningfully capture the supply opportunity that global disruption creates. That is a question whose answer will unfold over weeks and months. Maple Wire will track it. Subscribe so you get the update when it matters. Like this video if it gave you a complete and honest picture of what global energy disruption actually means for Canada. Share it with family and friends, particularly anyone in Alberta, British Columbia, or any province with a direct stake in Canadian energy economics. Send it on WhatsApp to anyone asking what the Hormuz situation means for their Canadian fuel costs, their job, or Canada's energy future. All official source links are in the description below. Stay informed. verify everything. And we will see you in the next update.